The Intergalactic Council chamber, an immense domed structure of shimmering alloy and gravitational fields, rarely saw such tension. The gathered representatives of 100 species shifted uneasily as the Skrell Dominion's war envoy, a towering figure of chitinous plating and blade-like mandibles, projected a star chart into the air. The contested sector flared red, an unremarkable expanse of space, save for its strategic proximity to a wormhole. The human claim is illegitimate, the envoy rasped, his voice resonating through the chamber's translation matrix. Per Council doctrine, disputed territories must be resolved through sanctioned conflict or diplomatic surrender. We invoke the right to challenge. At the opposite end of the chamber, Admiral Elise Carter remained still. Unlike most species, who displayed their emotions through bioluminescence, pheromones, or color shifts, humans had mastered the unsettling art of stillness. Her expression was unreadable, her posture relaxed but composed, as if the declaration of war were nothing more than an unexpected meeting on her calendar. Counselor Vryn, a gelatinous diplomat from the Arboreal Syndicate, wavered nervously in his containment shell. Perhaps negotiations. The Skrell have spoken, the envoy snapped. They expect formal recognition of the challenge. As per Council law, humanity may accept or surrender. A long pause followed. Elise glanced at the human delegation flanking her. Military officers and government representatives, their expressions carefully neutral. She turned back to the council and, with a slight shrug, said, "All right." The room hesitated, as if collectively waiting for an addendum. None came. The Skrell envoy narrowed his luminous eyes. "You accept." "Obviously," Elise said. "You called for a war. We're not surrendering." Another silence stretched, heavier this time. It was Vryn who finally broke it. "Admiral Carter, do you wish to review the terms of surrender before engagement?" Elise frowned. "Why would we?" The gelatinous counselor rippled in distress. "Standardized surrender terms must be established before conflict begins. This is to ensure controlled resolution and prevent unnecessary devastation. Every species follows this protocol." Elise exchanged a glance with General Anton Rourke, the grizzled head of Earth's Strategic Command. He rubbed his jaw, eyes narrowing in bemusement. "We don't have one." The room collectively stiffened. Even the Skrell envoy, poised for a battle-hardened response, faltered. "Explain." Elise exhaled a slow, measured breath. "We don't have a surrender protocol." Vryn's form pulsed erratically. That cannot be correct. Every species. We fight until we win," Rourke interrupted, his voice calm, matter of fact. "Or until there's nothing left." The chamber erupted into hushed murmurs, some incredulous, others alarmed. Even species unfamiliar with human warfare understood the implications. Battles were fought with contingencies, fail-safes, escape clauses. War was an equation where losses were minimized, surrender negotiated long before the final blow was struck. A species without that safeguard was unstable. A Zell-Theri whisper clicked from the shadows, its many eyes gleaming with unease. "Dangerous." Elise ignored the muttering and looked back at the Skrell envoy. "You wanted a fight. You have one." The Skrell's mandibles clicked in thought. Perhaps he believed it was a bluff. Perhaps he assumed humanity was posturing, playing a political game rather than speaking a fundamental truth. Whatever calculation he made, it led him to the only logical conclusion. So be it. The war began 3 days later. The first battle unfolded over the barren moons of Tarvax 6, a celestial graveyard of shattered rock and cold, drifting silence. The Skrell, veterans of 100 conflicts, followed their standard doctrine, a swift, overwhelming assault designed to cripple enemy morale. They struck hard, fast, confident that human forces would recognize their numerical disadvantage and invoke surrender protocols within the first engagement. But the moment their forces clashed, that assumption cracked. The humans did not break under superior firepower. They adapted, shifted, and countered with ferocity that disregarded attrition rates. Skrell formations that had dictated the course of battles for centuries were torn apart in hours, not through overwhelming force, but through unpredictability. Human pilots executed maneuvers that disregarded conventional tactics. Their ground troops advanced where retreat was expected, and their commanders responded to losses not with calculated fallback, but with escalation. On the bridge of the Skrull flagship, Supreme War Leader Zyril watched the battle unfold with mounting unease. His officers relayed casualty reports, higher than projected, unacceptable by their own standards. "Commander, deploy surrender channels," one of his tacticians urged. "The enemy must be given opportunity for honorable resolution." Zyril hesitated. It was early, far earlier than he had expected, but the Council demanded adherence to protocol. He signaled compliance. Across the battlefield, encoded surrender frequencies were transmitted, a universal gesture recognized by every intelligent species. It was a moment to pause, to retreat, to end the slaughter with dignity. The humans ignored it. Enemy response? Zyril demanded. None, War Leader. They continue their assault. Zyril's mandibles twitched. Then increase transmission strength. Ensure they understand. A sudden explosion rocked the flagship, sending ripples through the bridge. An incoming transmission overrode the command channels, direct from the Terran command vessel. Admiral Elise Carter appeared, her face shadowed in the flickering light of the battle outside. "Are you surrendering?" she asked. Zyril recoiled. "What? No. Then why are you sending us signals in the middle of the fight?" The war leader's claws tightened against the armrest. "This is standard surrender protocol. You are expected to acknowledge and enact terms. You started this war." Elise interrupted, voice like steel. "If you're not surrendering, get off this channel. We're busy." The transmission cut. Zyril stared at the empty screen, then at his officers, who looked equally bewildered. It took him a full minute to comprehend what had happened. They had not refused surrender. They did not even understand what was being asked of them. A cold realization seeped into his thoughts. The humans were not fighting for territory, nor for dominance in the traditional sense. They fought because that was the only way they understood war. There would be no ceasefire, no retreat, no mercy given or expected. A quiet dread settled over him. The Intergalactic Council would need to be informed. Immediately, before it was too late. The Intergalactic Council convened an emergency session. The Chamber's usual measured discourse replaced with an undercurrent of barely restrained panic. Holographic battle reports flickered in the air, displaying cold, irrefutable data, fleet losses, ground engagements, casualty projections. Every delegate present had seen wars before, but none had ever witnessed a species conduct one without the fundamental understanding that there should be an end. Counselor Vrin's gelatinous form quivered inside his containment shell as he addressed the assembly. The surrender transmissions were ignored. His voice wavered. Not rejected, ignored. As if they did not comprehend the signal at all. Across the room, Supreme War Leader Zyril remained unnaturally still. The imposing Skrull warrior, once so assured in his race's tactical superiority, now radiated quiet unease. His forces had suffered staggering losses, far beyond projections. The humans had seized every engagement with terrifying aggression, refusing every opportunity for a controlled resolution. "They knew," Zyril said finally, his mandibles clicking. "They received the signals. I verified it." His gaze swept over the council, and they did nothing. The room stirred uneasily. Diplomats and strategists exchanged glances, their appendages shifting in agitated displays of concern. No species had ever lacked a surrender protocol. It was not merely a military doctrine. It was the bedrock of civilization itself. Wars ended through negotiation, attrition, or mutual exhaustion, but they ended. No rational species fought to annihilation as a matter of course. The representative of the Zelthari leaned forward, their multifaceted eyes reflecting the holographic displays. "If what you claim is true, we are no longer dealing with a conventional adversary." Their mandibles clicked in calculated thought. "We are dealing with something different." Vrin pulsed anxiously. "The humans must be called before the council at once." 2 hours later, Admiral Elise Carter, and General Anton Rourke stood before the gathered assembly, their faces impassive as they faced a chamber filled with apprehension. They did not fidget, did not shift, did not exude any of the physiological cues most species relied upon to gauge intent. There was something unsettling about their stillness, their quiet control. Vryn took the lead, his gelatinous body oscillating with nervous energy. "Admiral Carter, General Rourke, do you understand why you have been summoned?" Elise nodded. "You're concerned about the war." "Concerned." The word emerged from Zyril in a low growl. "We are beyond concerned, Admiral. We are," he hesitated, as though reluctant to admit what all of them felt. "We are alarmed." Rourke's brows lifted slightly. "Alarmed?" The Zelthari representative interjected. "Your forces do not respond to standard surrender protocols. When offered honorable cessation, you escalate. When given an opportunity for peace, you press forward." "Why?" The humans exchanged a brief glance before Elise spoke. "Because that's not how we fight." A ripple of unease passed through the chamber. Vryn pulsed anxiously. "Surely, you understand the necessity of surrender terms." Rourke exhaled. "No, Counselor, we don't." His voice carried no defiance, only a calm, measured truth. "That's not part of our history. When humans go to war, we don't expect to stop until one side is incapable of continuing." A heavy silence settled over the room. Vryn's form dimmed. That cannot be true." Elise's expression didn't change. "It is." Zyril's claws curled against the armrests of his seat. "Every species has a surrender doctrine." "We don't," Elise said simply. "Wars in our history end through victory, mutual exhaustion, or destruction. We've never had an agreed-upon procedure where one side just quits." The silence stretched, suffocating. The Zelthari clicked their mandibles slowly. "And if you lose?" Rourke's lips quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. "We don't plan for that." Vryn recoiled slightly in his containment shell, the bioluminescent streaks across his form dimming in what the humans had come to recognize as horror. "You mean to say, if your forces were outmatched, if defeat were imminent, you would still not surrender?" Elise met his gaze evenly. "Correct." A quiet dread settled into the chamber, thick and suffocating. The implications were staggering. Zyril's mandibles twitched, his unease hardening into something sharper. "Then I propose an alternative," he said slowly. "A diplomatic mandate requiring humanity to adopt a surrender protocol." Elise tilted her head slightly. "You want to force us to surrender?" Zyril's claws tightened. "We want to ensure controlled resolution, to prevent unnecessary destruction." Elise's expression remained neutral. "Counselor Vryn," she said, turning slightly, "if the Arboreal Syndicate were at war and facing annihilation, would you surrender?" The gelatinous diplomat hesitated. "Of course. Our survival would be paramount." She turned to the Zelthari. "And your species?" A long pause. "Then, yes." Elise nodded. "And you assume that applies universally?" Zyril's gaze narrowed. "It must. A species without surrender is a species without reason." Rourke's voice was steady. "Or a species that learned a different lesson." A murmur swept the room. Vryn pulsed, uncertain. "And what lesson is that, General?" Rourke's expression darkened slightly. "That surrender isn't survival. It's just a slower form of defeat." The words hung in the air, their weight pressing into the minds of every delegate present. The Zelthari shifted uncomfortably. The Zyril envoy remained still, his mandibles clicking in quiet thought. Vryn seemed to sag within his containment shell, his form dimming further. Elise let the silence stretch before she spoke again, her voice calm, even. "You want us to adopt a protocol we've never needed, never used, and don't trust. That's not going to happen." Zyril's voice was careful, measured. "Then you leave us little choice." Elise met his gaze without flinching. "Neither do you." The Skrell's mandibles twitched, and for the first time in his long, war-worn life, Zyril understood something he had never truly considered before. The humans weren't refusing surrender. They simply didn't know how, and that made them the most dangerous enemy the galaxy had ever faced. The war ended, though not in the way the Intergalactic Council had expected. There was no peace treaty, no negotiated ceasefire, no dignified surrender. It ended because the Skrull Dominion simply could not afford to keep fighting. Their fleets were shattered, their armies ground down to nothing, their reserves depleted beyond recovery. The humans had waged war with the terrifying efficiency of a species that saw no alternative, pressing forward with relentless determination until there was simply no one left to oppose them. On the surface of Tarvax 6, where the first major battle had been fought, Admiral Elise Carter stood atop a ruined outpost, watching the last of the Skrull transports lift off into the dust-choked sky. They had been allowed to retreat, not because of negotiations, but because the humans no longer considered them a threat. It was not mercy, nor was it cruelty. It was simple, pragmatic calculation. The Skrull were beaten, and there was no point in wasting further resources ensuring their destruction. Beside her, General Anton Rourke surveyed the smoldering battlefield with a cold, appraising gaze. "They won't forget this," he said finally. Elise exhaled, slow and measured. "No," she agreed. "They won't." The silence between them stretched, filled only by the distant hum of human recovery teams moving through the wreckage. There was no celebration, no victory parade. Humanity did not revel in conquest. It simply ensured survival. 3 weeks later, the council met again, but this time under far different circumstances. The chamber was quieter, more subdued. The usual pomp and ceremony had been stripped away, replaced by a stark, undeniable truth. Humanity was no longer an unknown variable. They were a force the galaxy could not ignore. Elise and Rourke stood before the assembled delegates, their expressions unreadable as the council deliberated. The question was no longer whether humanity would be allowed a place among them. It was whether the galaxy could afford to exclude them. Vryn was the first to speak. His gelatinous form pulsed with resignation. The war was costly. Elise said nothing. She didn't need to. Zyril, once so certain of his people's superiority, was no longer the same warrior who had demanded the challenge. He sat stiffly, his mandibles clicking in slow, measured thought. "Your kind does not fight like the rest of us," he said. "You do not acknowledge surrender, do not yield when logic dictates you should. That makes you dangerous." Rourke tilted his head slightly, and the Skrull's mandibles twitched. "And it means that if we were to challenge you again, the cost would be unacceptable." A murmur passed through the chamber. They all understood the meaning behind those words. Wars in the galaxy had always followed a pattern: clashes, retreats, negotiations, resolution. But humanity had broken that pattern. Their wars ended only one way. The Zeltheri representative, who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally spoke. "There are many who now fear you, humans. They will not forget what you have done." Elise's gaze was steady. "Fear is a choice," she said simply. Vryn hesitated. "Then what would you have us choose?" Elise's expression did not change. "That's up to you." The chamber fell into silence once more. The council had gathered expecting demands, conditions, perhaps even threats. But humanity made no such claims. They had won, and yet they asked for nothing. That, in itself, was more unnerving than any declaration of conquest. After several long moments, Zyril exhaled slowly. "Very well," he said. "The Council recognizes humanity as an undeniable power in this galaxy." The words were careful, deliberate. Not an ally, not an enemy, simply a reality that could not be ignored. As the session concluded, the delegates dispersed, their conversations hushed and uneasy. Some regarded the humans with wary respect, others with outright fear. But one thing was certain: humanity had not just won a war. They had changed the nature of war itself.